our second talk today, and our speaker is Robert Weiss. He is a licensed clinical social worker and certified sex addiction therapist supervisor who has 25 years of experience as a clinician, program development specialist, and international educator, subject expert, and he currently serves as Senior Vice President of Elements Behavioral Health, a national family of addiction and behavioral health residential programs. Please welcome Robert Weiss.
Thank you, Dr. Cartwright, for accepting a lowly MSW. I think I'm the only non-doctoral person presenting, and I really appreciate that opportunity and that faith. So I've been working in the area of compulsive addictive sexual disorders for about 25 years, and I started pre-internet. So when I first started my work, there were people coming in, mostly men. I had a little practice in Los Angeles, and I was seeing guys who were struggling with phone sex, the old-fashioned kind, the kind that plugged into the wall. And they would call someone up for sexual arousal, interest, connection, and they would talk to them for 5 or 6 hours and run up $5,000 and $10,000 phone sex bills, and then they would pay them off. And they'd come back in a couple of weeks later with another $10,000 bill. They would go to their sister's house, their mother's house, their friend's house, and use their phones, etc. Or I was working with people who had huge stacks of pornography, the storage locker kind, where they would literally have lockers full of porn or garages full. And I probably would have had an interesting practice on the west side of Los Angeles had it not been for the internet. But then in the mid-90s, AOL came along and everything changed. So let me see, what I decided to do in this conversation with you guys is what I often have to do, which is I'm just going to give you a quick review of what sex addiction is and is not. Because the digital media part, which I think Natasha covered so beautifully in so many ways just a moment ago, is pretty similar whether you're dealing with rapidly changing imagery that is sexually arousing or rapidly changing imagery that involves gambling. It's really the same experience. In fact, I would suggest that in practice, sex addicts, if you will accept that term, and I'll give you some others in a moment, are most like compulsive gamblers in their searching, their hunting, their looking, their neurobiological arousal process is all very similar to the gambler. But actually, when we're doing treatment, it's more like an eating disorder. Because unlike compulsive gambling or alcoholism, we don't say to the person, well, we're going to ask you to never gamble again or never drink alcohol again. In other words, abstinence is not our priority. Like eating disorders, our priority is healthy sexuality, however that's defined by that person. So let's just look at my field a little bit for a moment. I want to give you access to the research because I'm not going to go into it because we don't have really enough time for me to do that. But I will tell you that if you want sort of an overview of this field, I would pull Marty Kafka. Dr. Kafka is an associate professor at Harvard, and he is on the Sexual Disorders and Paraphilias Committee for the APA, and he wrote and designed and did all the research for the proposed hypersexual disorders diagnosis, which was not accepted for the DSM-5, either in the diagnosis section or in the appendix. And if you want to get me riled up, say something to me like, well, you don't have enough research in your field, because what I would say is, how would we ever get the money to do the research in our field if there's no one proposing that there might even be a problem with consensual sexual behavior among adults in this country or among kids? And there most definitely is. In any case, Dr. Kafka in 2012 pulled together all of the Tier 1 peer-reviewed research in his hypersexual disorder diagnosis. And so I would ask you to look at the 3 or 4 pages of research. If you want to see the actual authors, it's all there. In it, part of what he does is he gives us a historical review of, did this issue of problematic, impulsive, compulsive sexual behavior exist in history? That's where you kind of start when you're creating a diagnosis. And he found that, yes, there were references going back to biblical times of what we might later have called Don Juanism or nymphomania, or people whose sexual behavior was interfering with their daily functions of living, with their daily life tasks, their daily lives. And he then looked at all the different models, and I want to briefly go over what they are. There's the most famous of them would be Patrick Carnes' addiction model, and I studied with Dr. Carnes for about 4 years. That's where a lot of my experience comes from. But he was not the only one. Both he and Eli Coleman were working at parallel times at the University of Minnesota in the 70s. And Eli Coleman, who has a wonderful sexual disorders program at the University of Minnesota, came up with this idea of sexual compulsion, or it being on the OCD spectrum, whereas Pat Carnes was looking at it being more as an addiction and in the addictive disorders. And in addition, we had the Kinsey folks, not to be outdone by Pat or Eli, who were studying and continue to study this thing they called out-of-control sexual behavior, something I know that we'd all like to say that we have. I have diabetes and I have out-of-control sexual behavior. It just doesn't sound very good. The APA called it sexual disorder NOS. All of these models have research behind them. All of these models have books and interviews and lots of information, but these are sort of the leaders of the field with the proposed concepts for what they would look like and what this issue really is. And what has really won out, at least in terms of the popular culture, is the term sex addiction, sexual addict. Eli Coleman has since retracted, stated that he does not feel that compulsive sexual behavior, addictive sexual behavior really does fall on the OCD spectrum. And I would absolutely agree with him. If only because the search for fantasy about sexual behavior produces a lot of pleasure. And OCD, as I'm familiar with it, really is much more about doing the same activity over and over again to relieve anxiety or dissociate or whatever it does, but it isn't necessarily pleasurable to be washing your hands or checking the stove. But when it comes to highly pleasurable behaviors like sex, gaming, gambling, you can have people who are doing something over and over again, but once pleasure is involved and they're in the pursuit of the pleasure, not just the anxiety reduction, then we're in the field of addiction. And Eli kind of acknowledged that a bunch of years ago. A couple of things I would just suggest reading, just to get a general understanding of where our culture is around looking at sexuality by gender and by behavior. I strongly recommend reading A Billion Wicked Thoughts, which was two MIT researchers had access to 200,000 search engine terms that AOL released to them in 2008, 7 and 8, with the word sex in it. And they had gender, they had age, they had race, and they were able to put together what people were searching for with the word sex, cross-culturally, cross-demographically, hundreds of thousands of people all over the United States. And they put that together with current neurobiological and sociological research and kind of came up with a very current view of human sexuality that I think is worth reading if you want to have a really current view of human sexuality. Just in terms of sex addiction, I would point you to the Voon study, which came out last year at Cambridge, where they're doing fMRI studies of people who self-identified as being sexual addicts or sexual impulsives. They fMRI'd 19 men who said they had these issues, and then 19 men who said they did not. And the study extensively goes into the differences that the fMRI brought up, especially in the more primitive parts of our brain, the amygdala, and really showed the differences between people who were looking at sex as simply an integrated part of their life and people who felt compelled to continue to search for that behavior over and over again. And you can see it in the brain, and I recommend looking at the Voon study, which I don't have time to present to you. Let's just run through the quick ones. Is sex addiction a legitimate mental health diagnosis in the United States? Well, it was actually in the DSM-2. It wasn't a full diagnosis, but it was a descriptor under sexual disorders NOS. There was something that said sexual addiction, and it was defined as repeated patterns of sexual behavior where other people are objectified or used as objects. And really, in that way, they were looking at it as a paraphilia, like a fetish. So like the person who only can have sex when they're being hit, or the person who only enjoys sex when they're wearing leather, or they sort of looked at it as this person only enjoys sex when it's casual, anonymous, and that person is objectified. And when they're in relationship with the person, they're not interested. The DSM 4 and the 4TR removed any reference to hypersexual behavior, except as a symptom or an outlier symptom, let's say of mania or something like that. But as its own criteria-based diagnosis, it never has existed. It was only a descriptor for sexual disorder NOS, and then it was taken out completely. And what fascinated me about it being taken out was the time at which it was taken out, because that was right about the time I entered the field. And it's really interesting to me that just as the problem began to escalate related to the internet and the access that people had to intensely stimulating experiences that they had really not had access to in the same way prior, that's when it got taken out. And while we, in my field, saw the escalation of behavior, I mean, I went from a small clinic seeing a couple of people to within 3 years of AOL and the internet, the modern internet, I probably had 120 clients and 8 therapists and groups every night, because there were so many people struggling and coming in struggling with what they felt was their own compulsive and addictive relationship to casual sex and pornography. It was considered for the 5. It's no longer being considered for the 5, and who knows what will happen and why. I did sit with the members of the DSM-5 committee. They told me things that I shouldn't say to you, but I really have no problem saying to you. One of the things they said that I thought was very significant was that the DSM-5 is in part a politically driven document. And I was a naive social worker. I actually thought that our diagnoses were based on research. And then they reminded me that the APA and the Sexual Disorders Committee in specific, they gave me an example. They said, we knew that homosexuality was not pathological by the mid-1960s, but it was not taken out of the DSM until 1971. And the reason for that was there was a political expediency in 1971 to take homosexuality out of the DSM as pathological because A, a homosexual was the head of the APA, and 2, gays were marching in the streets related to Stonewall and all that. The culture had changed, and thus it came out. But what concerns me is if they knew in 1965 that this was absolutely not pathological, how many people killed themselves, were institutionalized or arrested because of their behavior, which was already determined not to be pathological, but no one had the political will or ability to take it out of our diagnostic manual. And that was the example they gave me when I said, don't you think this sex addiction thing might have some validity? And they said, absolutely. And I said, well, what do you think about Pat Carnes? And they said, we think he's a pioneer. And I was like, oh, okay, so what about that diagnosis? They said, no way. There's no political will in the APA to look at consensual human sexual behavior as being problematic, and that's where it stands today. Nomenclature is a big problem in my world, big problem. Nomenclature is the science or system of choosing names for objects, experiences, and processes. All the labels below have different policy, social, medical, assessment, and treatment ramifications, and there's lots of egos involved behind each one. So whether you call this thing sexual addiction, sexual compulsivity, hypersexuality, hypersexual behavior disorder, out-of-control sexual behavior, or sexual impulsivity, each one of those has research behind it, names behind it, and it kind of reminds me of in my world, it reminds me of when we were looking for the HIV virus and the fact that political wrangling between different researchers kept our understanding of what the virus was to be released to the medical community to work on for medication, because there was infighting about who was going to get credit for what it was going to be called. And I don't know if any of you remember that, but I remember that really clearly. And that seems to be the truth in my field, where there are people who want to call it different things, and they're fighting for their research and they're fighting for their books and all of that. And my interest is in just fighting for the people who have the problem, being able to properly identify them. Because when you don't have a diagnosis, especially in an area that can produce shame and embarrassment in a culture where there's already what is a fairly conservative sexual culture in America, what happens is you get moral judgment. So if I don't like, or you get religious behavioral control, or you get misdiagnosis. So I can say, I really don't like your sexual behavior, and you're sleeping with men, and I think that's really bad. And in fact, I think that's sex addiction. You're a sex addict, or you're a hypersexual, and who is to say that I'm wrong? Because there's no diagnosis, there's no criteria. So anybody can call anybody anything, including all those nice names like nympho and all of that stuff. And we really don't have any way to counter that, because I cannot counter the unethical therapist who uses morality to try to change or shift someone's sexual behavior because they have seen that as addictive. Because we don't have criteria to identify the problem. This is how, by the way, and I've had clients come in who were diagnosed as manic depressive, for example, or bipolar, because they had all this manic behavior, all of this crazy behavior around sex, and they were staying up till 4 a.m, and they were seeing all this prostitutes, all this stuff, and there they were in my office on lithium or Depakote, even though there was no family history of bipolar disorder, and they really weren't but manic. All of their manic behavior was confined to their sexual activities. By the way, this is fairly familiar to us, or it should be, because I remember, certainly when I was growing up, what my dad, I remember, how we looked at alcoholism back in the 70s. My dad would look up on the TV, and if Mannix or Hawaii Five-0 had an alcoholic, it looked just like this. A man was lying in the gutter in a raincoat with a beard and kind of hair that was falling out, and he had a bottle stuffed in his pocket, and it was raining, and he had no family and no place to go, and that's what an alcoholic was. And my dad would look up at the TV and say, oh, well, that's a bum. This is about the same time that the DSM-1 put alcoholism under the personality disorders and called alcoholics the same as narcissistic personality, borderline personality, alcoholic personality disorder. So alcoholics were never too thrilled with psychiatry to begin with. But I think that it took someone like Betty Ford to come forward and say, you know, alcoholics aren't just those people. Alcoholic could be your grandmother. You know, and by the way, ladies, you should know that not only was she the first really major political and celebrity figure to come out and talk about drug and alcohol addiction, but she also was the first woman to publicly come out and talk about breast cancer. So if you ever want to light a candle for a really powerful woman, I would light one for Betty Ford. So let's go through the myths of the disorder that I treat, and then we can go on to talk about what it is. It's not going to be a valid diagnosis unless I'm a mental health clinician, so I have to rule out other disorders that might involve impulsive or compulsive or hypersexual behavior, if you will. So I've got to look at whether the person has ADD. We see about a 20% correlation between compulsive and addictive sexual behavior and ADD, adult attention deficit. Does someone have OCD? Are they being impulsive in their sexual choices? Are they seeing something without really thinking about it, ending up in a situation which is very ADD? Or, you know, are they manic? Or are they in some form of active drug abuse that's driving their disorder? So, and that's not to say, by the way, that you can't be bipolar and be alcoholic. So you could be depressed and be a sex addict, but I have to rule out anything that is going to drive a hypersexual behavior, and then if the hypersexuality exists by itself, then I have something that I can look at. It's also not valid unless I rule out crystal meth, cocaine, and stimulant abuse, because now that we have Viagra and Cialis, what used to be a softie is now, well, as I would say it, I'll put it this way, you can now do your speed and be up for 3 days, and do your Cialis and Viagra and be up for 3 days. Right? You can be up for 3 days and up for 3 days. And back in the 60s and 70s, when we did speed, we did things like dance and go to parties and go to hangouts and hang out and just be with friends or party, because you know it was a softie. But now that's no longer a problem. And so now we have people going and using these stimulants and abusing themselves for days and days and days. And by the way, this is not just gay men. Gay men abuse meth, and they will go off to bathhouses and sex clubs and sexual environments and engage in a lot of hypersexual activity, but the straight guys do the same thing. They just buy their coke and they go to a hotel room and they hire a bunch of prostitutes or lock themselves up for a weekend looking at porn. And we see very similar histories in these men and women. I don't really see the difference in sexual orientation in relationship to compulsive or addictive sexual behavior, except that gay men have an easier time finding sex, because men are more willing to go along with objectified sexual experiences that are non-relational than women. We're kind of built that way. And so it is much easier for a man to have a non-intimate, non-relational sexual experience if he's looking for sex with men than if he's looking for sex with women who want things like dinner and talk and movies and flowers and, you know. But our culture is changing. So it may well be that straight men are getting gay men's privilege, because women seem to be more and more interested in anonymous casual sex, especially our Tinder generation, who is kind of treating it like, you know, going to the gym, like a good workout. Sex addiction is not fun, and this I get a lot. You know, oh wow, that's the kind of addict I want to be. Wow, I could have all that sex that I could, you know. And I think, well, do you like to drink? And the person says, yes, I like to drink. And I said, well, you know what? If you like to drink, you would love alcoholism. You would get to be drunk all the time. You could drink as much as you want. You could be smashed. Oh, I would never want to be an alcoholic. So if alcohol is fun for the majority of us who use it as a social lubricant or some sort of bonding or anxiety reducer, then I would imagine that sex is pretty fun for most of us as a form of procreation, recreation, in whatever form you have it, but not if you're a sex addict. So if you have if your relationship to sexuality is driven, and I'll talk about what it's driven by, is driven not necessarily by the primary pleasure of being sexual, but more as a goal, and thank you, Natasha, for talking about this, the goal of dissociation, self-regulation, affect management. If the goal is to escape, then you have secondary gains that you're entering into that behavior for completely different reasons. So for example, when I think about that, I think about a guy I worked with who had a fight with his boss, and he had also had an alcoholic dad who used to yell at him and hit him. And the way he dealt with that sort of trauma feeling that came up for him when his boss was yelling at him was he went in the office, locked the door, and looked at porn for 4 hours. Now, he didn't masturbate. He didn't have an erection. But he spent 4 hours looking at image after image after image after image, and I will describe to you in a moment his neurobiological state, which is very different than the state of the man who walked in. Once he'd been watching for a while, his whole neurochemistry changed. And again, Natasha didn't talk about that, but I would imagine that the gamblers, as they're going to the casino, walking into the casino, hearing those sounds, that C chord that you talked about, that is hyperstimulating. Their heart starts pounding, their pupils are dilated, they're getting into a hyperarousal state because of the anticipatory fantasy of what they're about to get into. And in that way, again, sex addiction is most like compulsive gambling because it is not about orgasm. And just like gambling, if you're a compulsive gambler, it's really not about winning or losing. It's about the next card and the next card and the card after that. It's about anticipating and being in the, you call it the zone, I would say being in a dissociative state where you are so hyper-focused on whether it's the porn or the gambling in front of you that everything else goes away. And that is the goal. The goal is to escape, to use your own neurobiology to escape reality, if you will. And we'll talk more about this in a second. Sex addiction is not a guy thing. Certainly men get into trouble, it seems, more around sex and certainly around violent forms or perpetrating forms of sexual behavior. But nonetheless, let me assure you there are plenty of female sex addicts out there. And I'm really, really proud to say that I've had the opportunity to open the only 2 existing gender-separate residential intimacy and sexual disorder programs for women. And they are highly successful. And one of the things that we see is, and I appreciate Dr. Cartwright sort of mentioning this morning, is what we see in the women is they will often bounce back and forth between binge eating and hypersexual behavior. And it all goes back to trauma. You know, it goes back for them to fear of intimacy, fear of relationship, fear of connection. They want to be connected, but when they start getting connected and start feeling their dependency, they get terrified. And they start eating to self-soothe and self-regulate, literally pushing that person away. And then when the relationship ends, because that person wasn't intending to be with a 300-pound woman or a 250-pound woman, didn't work for them, then they lose all the weight and they start hitting the bars or going on the apps. And you can see them go back and forth and back and forth. So not a guy thing for sure, and not a gay thing for sure. Sex addiction is not, I don't consider it, I don't think my field considers it to be symptomatic of moral or religious failing. We are not sex negative, or we are, I should say it the other way, we're sex positive. So I'm not determining what kind of sexuality I think you should have based on my belief system, based on the Bible, based on what Western culture says. That's not of interest to me. What I'm interested in is how do you perceive yourself, and what sexual behaviors are healthy for you, and do you want to validate and embrace, and which ones are destructive for you and are creating havoc in your life, if you will. And what I'm not talking about is fetish behaviors or kink, or ego-dystonic gender dysphoria, or ego-dystonic sexual orientation. Which means, oops, that should, forget the offending piece, I'll get to that in a second. But what I'm saying is that if someone comes into me and they say, you know, I'm married and I have 3 kids, and I love my wife and I love my kids, but I have this thing about guys, and I keep going out and having sex with men, and I do that 3 or 4 times a month, and I think maybe I must be a sex addict. Well, just because they have ego-dystonic sexual arousal and they want to call it that doesn't mean that I'm going to call it that. Because I know what that might be is closeted homosexuality, it could be trauma, it could be bisexuality, it could be a whole bunch of stuff. So one of the challenges, again, without having a diagnosis is when someone comes in and that says they don't feel good about their sexual behavior and it doesn't fit in with their belief system or their lifestyle, I really have to go by my understanding of the research, which tells us that fetishes, kink, and orientation and gender identity are really pretty much fixed by adult life. So I have to say to those people, I'm sorry you don't feel good about it, but let's find a way for you to live with it. But I'm not going to call it addiction and then use behavioral methods to try to eliminate your attraction to men, because we don't think that really works. And the final thing that should have had its own bullet point is that sex addiction is not sexual offending. And when people hear the term out-of-control sexual behavior, they immediately think of somebody who's got a van and they're at the schoolyard and they're about to snatch and grab your kid. We have about an 8 to 10% correlation between sex addicts, people with compulsive and addictive sexual behavior, and those who cross the line into sexual offending. So there certainly is a population, but 90 to 92% of sex addicts are engaged in consensual sex. So let me just define sexual offending for you, because sexual offending is a legal term. So the age of consent in California might be different than the age of consent in Arkansas. So what's legal in one state and considered offending in one place is not considered to be legal in another. So how do we as clinicians really determine what is an offending behavior? And what I would offer to you is that sexual offending is simply non-consensual sexual behavior. So if David said to me, you know, I really have this thing about men that I'm dating, we're dating now, David. If he said, you know, I have this thing about guys I'm dating coming up and looking in my window when I'm showering in the morning and, you know, really taking a good look, and I'll take a good look, and then you can come on the side, we'll have a little fun and go have coffee. Well, then tomorrow morning when David sees me staring in his bathroom window, he's not going to say, oh my God, he's going to say, hey, because he invited me to go do that. But if David looked out of his window tomorrow morning and he saw a strange guy looking in while he was showering, he can call the police because I've offended him. So same behavior, but consent or non-consent. So if you're not old enough to consent, you're too physically or emotionally disabled to consent, you're not in a legal position to consent, that's offending. Touching somebody without their permission, showing them your genital, all offending. So what I'm saying is about a little over 90% of the clients that we treat do not engage in offending behaviors. And I'll tell you what they do in just a second. First, I want to talk about the symptomology, or what we see in sexual addiction, which really follows the characteristics of all addictions. So substance use disorder, alcoholism, compulsive gambling, and what we see is loss of control. I'm not going to keep looking at that porn. I know I have to get back to the work. I'm not going to jump out of bed after my wife goes to sleep to get on the computer and start looking at porn. I'm not going to call that ex-boyfriend. And yet people find themselves over and over again returning to behaviors. By the way, it is very warm in here. I don't know if anyone noticed that. It's not just me, but not good for after lunch. So if anybody has control over that, that would be really great, because warmth makes people sleepy. So they experience loss of control. They are unable to maintain promises or commitments made to themselves and others around their sexual behavior. And again, I'm not talking about orientation, and I'm not talking about kink, and I'm not talking about gender identity. I'm talking about, let's say, looking at porn or sort of prototypic sexual behaviors. They continue despite adverse consequences. Their boss told them to stop looking at porn in the workplace. They're going to track them, and they know they're going to get in trouble. So they decide to go in the office late at night and look at porn because they figure they're not being tracked late. I mean, they do stuff like that. Or they have spouses who find out about it and they get into trouble. They get arrested. They have obsession or preoccupation. Over time, the pursuit and the search for sex becomes the driving obsession of their life. So their children, their family, their relationships, their work, their schooling, it all suffers because their primary goal is to get or be around sexual experience and sexual arousal. I just want to say it again because this is going to be in here, but I want to point it out. Sex addiction is not about the sexual act. It's about everything that precedes it. No more than compulsive gambling is about winning or losing. But if I get up this morning and I think, oh, my wife's going to be out of town this weekend, or my boyfriend or husband, oh, and by the way, I have a history of profound abandonment and abuse, and now I'm going to be left alone for the weekend. So I start feeling anxious. I'm not aware of the anxiety. What I'm aware of is, boy, I'm really horny, because my clients sexualize their affect. So they don't think, oh, my spouse is going to be out of town, I'm going to be kind of lonely, I need to make plans, call some friends. My clients think, oh, my spouse is going to be out of town, I can go get laid. And so they may know that on Monday, and the spouse isn't leaving till Friday, but they will spend all week checking out websites, flirting with people, getting phone numbers, looking at porn, talking to prostitutes. So they're setting the whole thing up, and as they do that, they're getting what they're really in it for, which is the neurochemical dissociation or the neurobiological dissociation that comes with intense anticipatory fantasy. And by the way, we're all talking about the same thing. We're talking about being in the zone, right? We're talking about being in that dissociative state where you are hyper-aroused and hyper-vigilant and hyper-focused on what you're doing, but everything else kind of fades away. And in that way, if you have trauma, abuse, or you are inept in social interactions, you can find a place to go where you will be self-soothed, self-regulated, feel really good, and not necessarily have any consequences because all you're doing is looking, or all you're doing is searching, and it's all of that ritual and fantasy that the addiction is really about. The sex itself is kind of just the end point. It's a, what would you call it, an intermittent reinforcement. But what always reinforces, what always feels good is looking at the porn, cruising the people, getting the cards, all of that kind of stuff. And I put this here even though it isn't a typical chemical dependency symptom, but I do think you mentioned it, Natasha, you mentioned this also, the experience of objectifying myself and objectifying the experience. So sex addicts will turn themselves into an object to be used by others, and then they turn other people into objects, or they're literally looking at objects or experiences. But those aren't people. They are there to turn them on, they're there to arouse them, they're there so they can have this experience. And they themselves disconnect from their families, their friends, their relationships, and their emotional life because they are so singularly focused on this. So literally, I am an object, you are an object, and we are in this objectified relationship with each other that really doesn't have any, that has a lot of emotional meaning for me, but may not mean anything in real life. Okay. So what are sex addicts doing? I talked about that. They're doing what a lot of people are doing. They are compulsively using porn with or without masturbation. And we're hearing a lot now about Erectile dysfunction in young men related or porn-induced ED, I think is what we're hearing about, which is young men who are starting porn. You're looking at a fair amount of porn on a very regular basis at 13 or 14, and then they go out with a woman at 16 or 17 and they try to have a sexual experience and they're unable to get erections. And what that has to do with is that they are hyperstimulating so frequently to this endless high and stimulation that they have available to them in the cyber world and in the hookup world, that when they actually go to a real live connection with a human being who has feelings and who they need to build a relationship with, and that's not arousing to them. They're so used to the hyperarousal, and we need a lot more study, which there's very little of, what that is really about. There's a guy named Gary Wilson who did a TED Talk called Your Brain on Porn. And he now has a website where all these young men are in the no-FAP movement. The no-FAP movement means no masturbation. They're not going to masturbate. And the hundreds of thousands of men write into Gary's site and talk about their addiction to porn. And I asked him, he's not a psychologist, he's an animal behaviorist, and I asked him, do you think these men have trauma or social ineptitude? Do they have difficulties connecting with other people? And he said, I don't think so. I have a box that says trauma, and then they all check no. And then I think, as a clinician, someone can say to me, well, my mother was raped by another guy and I watched it and then she, died 3 years later, but I didn't have any trauma. If you ever work with clients who have profound trauma. So I don't expect that someone necessarily is going to check a box on a computer screen, not even knowing necessarily what trauma is. So we really don't know. We don't have the research to tell us what this porn-induced ED is about, but I would suggest it has something to do with becoming so hyperstimulated that what is considered healthy or normal is no longer interesting. So they're anonymously hooking up online or with hookup apps, and hookup apps are the crack cocaine of sex addiction. Just want to tell you that, because when you have a button on your phone that says Yelp, and you can press that button and look for a good Italian restaurant within 2 miles or 3 miles or 5 miles, that makes that experience much easier, and it'll give you maps and you can make a reservation. But I can also say to my phone, Siri, where are the hookers? And my phone knows that word, and it will geolocate escort services within a half mile, a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, with phone numbers, and maps and reviews of the different prostitutes in the escort service. So people are using technology and have climbed on the technology bandwagon to access immediate sexual gratification, sexual arousal, sexual fantasy in ways that weren't possible before. Adult bookstores, strip clubs, sexual exchange. We see this a lot in women, where even though they don't necessarily need it, they will exchange themselves sexually for drugs or for favors. And a lot of time what I see in those women is it's an attempt to have power, because if you desire me, then I feel like I'm in control. And so if I can be very sexualized, if I've got the cleavage and the really tight this and lots of red lipstick and the arrow pointing down on my necklace, and I get you to want me, then I feel safe, which is very typical for a trauma survivor. It's interesting to me, by the way, that we reject the concept of hypersexuality as a separate diagnosis, but we don't reject the idea that people who have sexual abuse and trauma can reenact that sexual abuse and trauma in adult life. But somehow that seems to be so disconnected from this issue that we're talking about that it's almost like people just can't seem to understand how someone would be addictive around sex. Let me get through this quickly. I am talking really fast and I'm really nervous, so I'll do my best. Well, you guys all have these degrees, and I'm just a lowly social worker. So they're going to prostitutes, sensual massage parlors, one of my favorite denial terms, sensual massage. When you like to say that to your partner, you had a really bad day at teaching today, and so I just stopped off for some sensual massage, and I'm in a much better mood. So I would say to a man, so you see prostitutes a couple of times a week? Oh, no, I don't see prostitutes. Pride, ego, right? So you lie down on a table, someone rubs you all over with oil to masturbate you to orgasm, you pay them, but that's not seeing a prostitute. And quite honestly, I have no judgment on whether they see prostitutes or not, but I would like them to own the behavior for what it is and call it for what it is. It makes them more able to make better choices for themselves. By the way, I'll often say to the married guy, I think it's fine if you want to go see prostitutes, but do check it out with your wife on the way out the door. If it's okay with her, it's okay with me. And they look at me like I'm like, well, rather than lie and manipulate and, hang out around, why don't you just ask? And if it's, and then you can be in relationship with your, addicts don't ask. Addicts, what is the word? Addicts ask for forgiveness, but not permission, I think is how we put it. So sex addicts are constantly cruising. The idea of a shark comes to mind, that they constantly have to be moving in order to breathe. Well, sex addicts, in order to get their narcissistic needs met, because they are very narcissistically vulnerable, they will constantly be seeking attention and validation that is sexualized. So it isn't just having sex, or even getting somebody to do something sexual. It can be getting that card. It can be getting you to kind of look me in the eye and give me that look. It can be, I'd like to have coffee with you later. Anything that is going to stimulate that feeling that I am in control over this person who is arousing to me, or this experience that is sexually arousing to me, starts the process. Let me go through quickly. Sex addicts push boundaries. They view no as a challenge, so they can be predatory but not offending. Multiple affairs, anonymous infidelities, they're sexting, they're abusing social networks, they're involved in virtual sexuality now in the virtual worlds that we have online. And we see repeated predatory crossing of professional boundaries. So I see a lot of physicians, I see a lot of therapists, I see, anyone want to guess what the number one profession is that I see in sex addiction treatment? Not pastors, but I have had enough rabbis for a minion in the clinic that I had, and I've also had enough Catholic priests probably. I've had lots of pastors. But any other guesses? Most popular profession that we see? Attorneys, by far. And I would imagine it's something to, well, I'm not even going to tell you why. You can make your own guesses. I have some ideas of my own. But these sort of powerhouse, highly competitive, living sort of from here up, attorneys are often coming into treatment for these kind of issues. By the way, they're also working 90 hours a week, very poor self-care. It's all about work. And then they're actually, and let me back up for a second, if I think about addiction, in general, the word that comes to mind, which is counterintuitive, is deprivation. That addicts deprive themselves of intimacy, of relationship, of self-care, of self-regulation, of self-soothing, of interdependency, because they're caught in their bubble of me and this objectified experience. So we often see people who engage in very poor self-care, very poor they're not taking good care of their relationships, they're not taking good care of their work, they're not taking good care of themselves. And most of all, addicts live double lives. They're living a secret double life that you don't know about because it's going on in the background. And the digital world has really made that much easier. Because with a sex app, I can simply load it on my phone. Literally, I could put, if I was on Grindr or Ashley or Tinder or any of them, I could leave it on, I could put it in my pocket, and that would show me as available and looking for sex. So anybody within 100 yards, 200 yards, everybody know about the hookup apps and how they work? You really probably want to know that. So my phone will vibrate in the middle of a meeting because someone's looking for me for sex. I didn't even do anything. I just had my phone on and the app is open. So then I can go to the restroom. Hey, you want to meet for lunch? Yeah, you're hot, you're hot. A little bit of sexting. By the way, that's where sexting goes on. Unfortunately, the former Congressman of New York, Anthony Weiner, you remember Anthony Weiner, right? Yeah. Now, I understand that he had a married wife, and I understand that he was a congressman. I understand his wife was 8 months pregnant, and he was attempting to hook up with other women. Big surprise. But what really pissed me off about him is he didn't understand technology. I mean, who puts their penis on Twitter? And that is what he did. He did not understand that, as many older people don't, and I mean over 35, that the culture of the internet is different in every place, and there are different ways of culturally communicating, culturally connecting. By the way, as long as I'm talking to you clinicians, let me just say this really quickly. I think we now have an obligation, if you are a treatment clinician of any sort, to be involved in and understand in a very personal way, having spent a fair amount of time, the digital world. Because when I went to grad school, if I was going to study Latino people, I had to study Latino culture. And if I was going to work with African Americans, I had to study African American culture. And yet, for some reason, therapists feel like they can work with younger people and their parents and not know a lot about the internet other than Facebook and sending a text occasionally. And that really doesn't work for me. I think we have a professional obligation to be in that world. And I teach courses on internet culture. Great thing to talk about at some point. So I get this a lot. Well, how much sex is addiction? I got this from JAMA. Somebody from JAMA called me and said, we're doing this thing about, we're doing this piece on sex addiction. This is hysterical, at least to me. So how many times in your marriage do you have to have sex with your wife before you're a sex addict? Is what they wrote me. And I'm thinking, this is like a really important journal. And it would seem to me that they would get that it's sort of like the same question as how many drinks make an alcoholic? Or how many hands of blackjack make a gambler? We don't really look at addiction in that way. I might have 2 drinks and I'm under the table. You might have 5 drinks and you're perfectly fine. So very different quantitative experience. And then I get this question, well, what kind of sex? I mean, surely if you're into rubber dolls or you really like people's feet or you like to wear rubber panties, that must mean, and the truth is, and I'll say it to you in a different way, does that mean that if you drink whiskey, you are an alcoholic, but if you drink vodka, you're not? So we do not define compulsive sexual behavior by who you have sex with or what kind of sex you have. Addictive disorders overall are not really determined qualitatively, are they? Quantitatively, they're determined qualitatively. How is this substance or experience or behavior or experience affecting the functionality of that person's life? Is it interfering with their primary life goals, with their primary relationships? Is it causing them to have negative consequences? I mean, that's how we look at addiction. But we don't say 3 drinks and you're an alcoholic and 2 drinks and you're not. So I would say the same thing about sex. How is this person's relationship with their sexual behavior and their fantasies around their sexual behavior affecting their day-to-day life and their functionality? And usually I see people at the point of crisis. So it's when the spouse is going to leave, they've gotten arrested for seeing prostitutes, their wife found huge amounts of this or that on the computer, and they're going to leave unless, I see people when they are in crisis, which is, obviously an opportunity. The kinds of consequences that they have empty, non-intimate relationships or very little to no relationship ability in terms of intimacy. I can be married, but my marriage is going to be non-intimate. Because what you don't know is I have this whole secret life going on, and so not only am I not emotionally or intimately available to you, but I'm quite hidden from you. They have multiple relationship losses, relationship damage, disconnected, disorganized family lives, job and educational losses, sexually transmitted disease, unwanted pregnancy, depression, anxiety, and suicide. And I did light up suicide because if you think that compulsive addictive sexual behavior doesn't lead to those kind of problems, I remind you about the Ashley Madison hack that happened over the summer. I lost 2 patients and a peer. One of my colleagues killed himself because he was acting out sexually, and he was the head of a sexual addiction clinic, and he was found on the Ashley hack, and he just killed himself. And I have seen people go to meetings, give up, jump off buildings. They just can't stop their sexual behavior, and it is destroying their life, and they don't know what to do. And they can't seem to get better. Co-occurring addictive disorders, certainly with stimulants, for example. I often see people with stimulants relapse, and this is, by the way, let me back up and just make a little pitch here. It makes me crazy that you can go to any mental health or addiction center in this country, and when you get your biopsychosocial, they will ask you about eating, exercise, they'll ask you about relationships, your social life, your education, your family life, have you had any history of depression? They will not ask you if you masturbate. They will not ask you how is your sexual life going, as if that was some kind of part of us that doesn't have anything to do with our whole humanity. How is it that we don't ask people about sexuality, especially in environments where we're often seeing people with early trauma or sexual abuse or those kinds of issues, and yet we don't, and we're glad to talk to them about that. But we're not as willing to talk to them about, you're pointing at something, you're pointing at her. Because I have time. I have no time. Wow, that's pretty amazing. So let me find something to finish with here, if you don't mind. Whoops, you don't want to see that. Give me 1 second. I thought I talked fast, but not. Okay, let me, obviously I'm not going to get to a lot of things I want to talk about with you folks, but I will, I'm going to take just 2 minutes here. So when we're talking about the behavioral or process addictions, by the way, it's a 3:45 session, right? It ends at 3:45 and I have 10 minutes for questions, ends at 3:40? 3:25? Okay. Well, let me just say this really quickly. When I think about the process addictions, I think about naturally occurring functions that have run off the rails, where you and I might enjoy, I enjoy overeating at Thanksgiving. I enjoy a little extra work when I've got a certain project going on. I might be a little hypersexual when I'm dating and starting a new relationship. But these are not defining, this is not the defining focus of my life. And when I do those things, gamble, overeat, have a sexual experience, I'm doing it for the primary gain, which is the pleasure or the activity or the social relationship. Addicts go back over and over again to the same behavior for the secondary gain, which is dissociation, self-regulation, escape, and affect management. And therefore, they're doing the same things that the rest of us are, except they're doing them in ways that are causing them to have profound problems. I will end with one thing, which is, boy, I'll never do a TED Talk. All right, I'll just tell you, there are 2 things I want to tell you. Number one, I want to tell you what sobriety is, because I think it's important to understand. We don't define sobriety and sexual disorders by abstinence. We define it in a contractual way, much as they do with eating disorders. So we are not eliminating behavior. We are researching and looking at their history of behavior, and then we are regulating it and bringing it into relationship or accountability. That's what you do with eating disorders. That's what you do with sexual disorders. The last thing I'll say is that the internet has really, we have something called the 3 A's, and I just want to mention those to you. Accessibility, affordability, and anonymity. That is what has driven the problem of the internet. There was a lot of friction in the past. If I wanted to go buy some porn, you know, I had to get dressed, go somewhere, leave my house, go to that icky place. Someone might see me, pay the money, get it, drive home in a paper bag. You know, now if I want to look at porn, just like the gambling, all I do is click a button, and in 0.34 seconds, I have access to unlimited amounts of porn. So for people who have impulsive challenges, who have emotional and social challenges, it's just so easy to lose yourself in this incredibly emotionally dopaminergic high. And the last thing I want to say is this, I'm sorry. When I'm working with a drug addict who's driving down to the dealer's house to buy drugs, and he's got the money in his pocket, and he's got the appointment to pick up the drugs, if I were sitting with him in the car, I would notice his heart was pounding, his pupils are dilated, his hearing is more acute, his hands are a little bit clammy. He's in a state of mild euphoria. There's adrenaline, there's dopamine. And by the way, his thinking is pretty narrow, right? Because when you have a release of adrenaline, it doesn't allow us to really use our prefrontal lobe. It's called fight or flight, right? You just kind of narrow your thinking and you go to survival. Well, my clients are so excited. So you're so excited about getting the drugs, you're also in that neurochemical state. So my question to you is, if that guy goes down to the dealer's house and gets the drugs and puts them in his body, at what point is he high? Is he high not until he's gotten the drugs, or is he high as he's driving down to the dealer's house? Meaning I can see there's a neurochemical change in his body, he's thinking differently, responding differently. Most people would suggest that he's begun, the change in his body has begun long before he's got the drugs in his body. And so I would ask you, well, what is driving that change if he has not taken any drugs? And the answer is anticipatory fantasy. You know, it's all about being in the idea of what I'm going to go do. And it's no different for the people I work with who spend hours, and I used to work with people who would spend 3 hours driving around the same block looking at the prostitutes. Why not just stop and pick one up? You know, and some of them would just go home without even hooking up. But they would say they would wear out their tires looking for prostitutes. And that is not about sex. It's about obsession. Anyway, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
I know you talked about sex addiction not being predatory. How does it relate?
No, it is predatory.
Okay.
But it's not offending.
It's not offending. How does it relate to a child? Have you done any research dating back to like kids that are like 5, 6 years old? Because I have a client that was 6 years old who got charged with a felony. He violently raped his 5-year-old classmate.
So again, we're talking about offending, which is fine. I just want to make the distinction. I'm talking about people who don't offend. But I guess, I don't know if this is the answer to your question, but many, many offenders will say that they knew they were different sexually at 8, at 10, at 12. They knew something was different about them. And in like terms, many of the men and women I work with will say that they knew they had a different relationship with sexuality at 8, 10, 12, 14. The thing is, we don't look at children as being sexual beings until they're 18. And so they're usually 25 or 30 by the time they make it into our offices. But the problems that we see in human sexuality start often prepubescent.